Hello and welcome to this fourth event in our RESET.21 forum series. It's a series which is designed to stimulate the sorts of conversations that we need to have to respond to our current climate emergency. I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Boomerang language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And a big welcome to all of you, wherever you might be tuning in from to this evening's discussion. I'm Ali Moore, I'm a journalist and a broadcaster, and for my sins I've spent a number of years living in both Beijing in China and also in Singapore, which gives me a real global perspective on the current climate challenge, which is not irrelevant to our discussion this evening, which is titled Hot, Wet and Violent: Climate and Global Security Consequences. We'd like to thank our major partners for this series: the City of Melbourne, RMIT University, Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, the Safe Climate Fund, and our major venue partner, the Capitol Theatre, which is a carbon neutral theatre, and I'm sitting in it right now, along with a couple of our guests. It is a hybrid event this evening. We have two guests here in the Capitol Theatre, two joining us online, and of course you too can join the conversation online by asking your questions over slido.com. If you hop on to slido.com and you can submit your questions by signing into hashtag RESET21. You can also upvote questions if there's a question that you really like and put it at the top of the list. As you know, tonight's event is part of the National Sustainable Living Festival, which is on throughout February, and it also builds on last year's National Climate Emergency Summit. If last year, 2020, was an extraordinary year, well, 2021 is shaping up as no less so. The pandemic has really changed the geopolitical landscape, and there's plenty of speculation about what that means for the future, whether we will in fact face a more fragmented world order in the post-COVID era. But of course, right now, there is a significant threat to global stability, and it comes from climate change. It's very real and it's very present. Just 2 weeks ago, the US Defense Department announced that it will prioritise climate change considerations to mitigate what it calls this driver of insecurity. The implications of what is an unprecedented existential security threat stretch from individuals to communities to nations to regional and international relations. If there's a major drought in one place that affects food production, the problem doesn't end there. How are people fed? How are livelihoods earned? How is stability maintained? So very quickly, a challenge in one part of the world can become a challenge in another part of the world. And that is incredibly pertinent to this country, to Australia. We sit in one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. So how well prepared are we? And how much capacity do we have to respond? Tonight, there's some of the questions and the challenges that we'll look at, and the risks also that face Australia and the region unless we take urgent action to tackle and deal with the climate emergency. So to our speakers this evening, each will give a short address before we go to our panel discussion, but I'm going to introduce all of them to you before we get underway with our first presentation. Major General Munir Zaman, retired, joins us via Zoom from Bangladesh. He's the former military advisor to the President of Bangladesh, the current chairman of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, and he's worked extensively on the security implications of climate change. Joining us also via Zoom, but this time from Canberra, is Admiral Chris Barry, retired. Chris is a member also of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, and he was the chief of the Australian Defence Force from 1998 to 2002. Since then, he's worked on strategic leadership issues at Oxford University, the National Defence University in Washington, and also at the ANU. With me here, I'm very pleased to say, in the Capitol Theatre is Adjunct Professor Cheryl Durrant. Cheryl is a fellow of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research Australia. She's recently retired after 30 years with the Australian Department of Defence, where she served as Director of Preparedness and Mobilisation. And it's very relevant that in this capacity, Cheryl led the climate risk scenario development for the Australian Interdepartmental Secretaries Group on Climate Risk. And last but certainly not least, we have also in the Capitol Theatre with us this evening, Major Michael Thomas, retired. Dr. Thomas is a Senior Fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Centre for Climate and Security. He's a graduate of the Australian Defence Force Academy, and he's also the author of the book, The Securitisation of Climate Change, Australian and United States Military Responses. An enormous welcome to our four speakers this evening. If you can just imagine this entire theatre filled with applause, that's what's happening in the individual living rooms and studies of our audience tonight. Our first speaker this evening is Major General Munir Uzaman. Major General, over to you.
Over the next 15 minutes or so, as I can begin my presentation, I shall be talking to you about a case study of Bangladesh, because I consider Bangladesh to be the global laboratory for climate change impacts in terms of security implications. Everything that we talk about, the security implications of climate change, is happening here in Bangladesh right now. And those impacts are grave. So as we can see Bangladesh, you would understand that these are the implications anywhere else in the world, but they vary from country to country. But overall, what is happening in Bangladesh are the consequences that you would see in other parts of the world. Climate change today is recognized as a major security issue that poses serious global threats. Climate change can affect individuals, communities, societies, states, and regions. If unchecked, climate change is likely to aggravate old and trigger new tensions. It brings hunger, disease, poverty, and poses a threat to social and political stability of societies and states. NASA scientists have observed that the Earth's surface is warming, and many of the warmest years on record happened in the last 20 years. Climate change leads to other long-term implications such as sea level rise, loss of ice mass, melting of the glaciers, shifts in flower and plant blooming, and extreme weather events, and many more. Bangladesh, as I said at the beginning, is a frontline state in the face of climate change impacts. Bangladesh's economy is more at risk to climate change than any other country in the world. Bangladesh has also suffered an economic loss of $2.8 billion in 2017 alone, only due to extreme weather-related events. Between 1991 and 2018, Bangladesh faced 191 big disasters caused by climate change-induced effects. Climate change threatens the lives and future of over 19 million children in Bangladesh as of today. And today, Bangladesh also faces a major challenge of salinization. We have had several disasters, and the very recent ones are Cyclone Sidr, Ayla, and Amphan. The mean temperature across Bangladesh is projected to increase between 1.4 degrees to 2.4 degrees by 2050 and 2100. By 2050, with the projected 19.68 inches rise in the sea level, Bangladesh may lose approximately 11% of its landmass, affecting immediately 15 million people living in the low-lying coastal regions. It also has adverse impacts as we try to achieve the United Nations SDG goals. As you can see on the screen, it affects on all the major goals that we are trying to achieve, from goal 1, 4, 5, 13, 17, and many more. 27 million people are predicted to be at risk of sea level rise in Bangladesh by 2050. And I would say sea level rise happens to be one of the grave causes of security implications of climate change in Bangladesh. Coastal communities, islanders in Bangladesh have been realizing that sea level is increasing here, affecting their lives and livelihood in recurrent extreme climate events. Energy infrastructures all over the country are becoming extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. So, if you see on the table, it has all the difficulties that a country can face. We are only a meter above sea level, which makes Bangladesh extremely vulnerable. We are also an extremely densely populated country. Dhaka alone today has 18 million people in a very small unplanned city. Scientists have predicted that 25% of Bangladesh's total landmass will be lost to the sea in the coming decades. And in a country where 50 million people live already under the poverty line, the problems can be aggravated many, many folds in the coming years. River erosion has become a major problem due to climate induced conditions, and approximately 10,000 hectares of land is lost to erosion every year. About a million people are directly affected by riverbank erosion every year. Displaced from their birthplaces, these people have to move to other places which are already very densely populated. By 2050, Bangladesh could see a very large population of anything between 25 to 30 million people displaced by sea level rise conditions. We are also very prone to natural calamities, which are being aggravated by the conditions of climate change, and cyclones and storm surges are common events in the coastal areas of Bangladesh that have devastating effects in an areas where 25% of the population reside. 4.5 million people live in coastal areas vulnerable to cyclones, and 3 million are at risk from drought in other areas. So we have a combination of flooding, disasters, and drought, all induced by climate change conditions. Climate change can also affect on the health condition and has an adverse impact on the health of the people. Climate change impacts on health in three major ways: creating conditions conducive to outbreaks of infectious disease, increasing the potential of transmission of vector borne diseases, and hindering the future control of diseases. Increased temperature may result in different types of complicacy of human health in Bangladesh. Conditions of drought are also increasing in some areas in Bangladesh due to the change in rainfall patterns as a result of climate change. Food becomes another major source of insecurity due to climate change induced conditions. According to 2020 Global Hunger Index, Bangladesh has been ranked as 75th out of 107 qualifying countries. With a score of 20.4, Bangladesh has a serious issue concerned with the level of hunger, which is now becoming very serious in climate induced conditions. By 2050, rice production is expected to drop by 10%, and wheat production will drop by 30%, with little expectation of population growth to cease. So you can imagine in one score, the food production is drastically falling due to climate change conditions, and our population continues to grow. So we have double challenges due to climate change impact conditions that affects the food security of the state. Water is another major source of insecurity in climate change conditions in Bangladesh. Water has become an element of mixed vulnerability for the country. The region has more water when it does not need, and less water when the need is most acute. 2-degree temperature rise could melt half of the glaciers of Hindu Kush in the Himalayan region, meaning due to the uneven and rapid melting of the Himalayan glaciers, Bangladesh and the region is going to experience more severe flooding in the coming years and decade. And beyond that, the region and Bangladesh will go through a severe state of drought. Increased flash floods, erratic droughts will devastate Bangladesh's existential water issues. The contamination of groundwater by arsenic has become another issue that is hitting the country as a whole. Arsenic poisoning in Bangladesh has already hit 50 million people and estimated to risk the exposure of arsenic through consumption of water from contaminated groundwater and pumping of tube wells has become a major source of health insecurity. And according to the WHO, this is perhaps the biggest mass poisoning of people due to climate change induced water conditions. Water salinity in Bangladesh is a major problem. There is severe impact of water salinity due to sea level rise and due to changes in the water flow patterns in our sweetwater rivers. This has been affecting the cultivation lands, which are mostly in the coastal areas, so therefore the food productivity is already falling. It also affects the salinity on our rivers, and we have a range of dying species of our sweetwater river fish on which much of the protein intake of the country depends, and a large number of fishing community also depends for their livelihood. Shortage of safe drinking water due to salinity intrusion because of increased sea level rise in the coastal areas has become extremely prominent. And areas like Barishal, Khulna, Chittagong will be affected severely by up to 55% by the year 2050. But perhaps one of the biggest problems that the country is facing or will face more severely will be from human displacement of people. Climate change could trigger large scale displacement and migration from one region to another in search of new avenues of employment and settlement. The forecasted land erosion will cause displacement of coastal population, most of whom are already poor and landless. According to several authors, between 64,000 and 1 million Bangladeshis are rendered homeless every year due to riverbank erosion. Climate refugees is going to be a major source of insecurity due to human displacement. Sea level rise in Bangladesh will perhaps take away a quarter of the land mass of the country and render a large number of people homeless, and they'll be in search of new places to live, settle, and find avenues of their livelihood. You must be aware of the world's largest mangrove forest called the Sundarbans, which is in the south of the country. This forest is under severe threat due to sea level rise and salinity. And without going through the details in the slide, I would say in summation that the forest is dying right in front of our eyes. The forest is not only a source of livelihood to a large number of people who depend on it, but it is also a sort of a shield in the south of the country that protects the country from severe water surges and cyclones. With the dying forest, that shield is now eroding. With the erosion of the forest due to sea level rise and due to salinity, we're also losing a large number of species of fish and the very wide biodiversity that is housed in the forest. So the loss of the Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, has a severe impact on the ecosystems of the country and the region. We have had some major cyclones in the last few years, and the impacts of Cyclone Isla is still being felt throughout the country. It has affected the livelihood of at least 4 million people. It has resulted in mass migration of people from within the country. To date, about 35% of the affected communities have permanently migrated towards northern and hilly regions of the state, with unable to go back to their homes till today. And similar stories also are affecting the impacts of Cyclone Sidr and the other cyclones that happened in the recent past. Bangladesh has got a fairly robust response mechanism in terms of planning. We've got a National Adaptation Program for Action, or NAPA. We've got also the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. We've got the Bangladesh Climate Change Trust together with the Bangladesh Change Trust Fund. And we also got Climate Fiscal Framework. So in terms of working out papers and strategies, we've done very well. But unfortunately, that doesn't translate to implementation. We are way behind in implementing many of the strategies and the plans, primarily because of lack of funds. The country doesn't have sufficient fund of its own to implement the strategies to meet the challenges of climate change. The international fund that was promised in several COPs have not yet been coming to the country like many other countries, and therefore we are still remaining extremely vulnerable to the threats of climate change, as I have very briefly introduced to you. Let me just briefly touch on the points without explanation, how it also affects the region. In South Asia, more than half of the world's total poor live in this region. So therefore, from demographic size, this is a place where bulk of the humanity lives today, but has become extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In the past decade, approximately 700 million people in the region were affected by one or more climate-related disasters. Between 2000 and 2017, natural disasters in the region caused damage worth 150 million US dollars. We also have severe problems of water security in South Asia, particularly because of the global warming that is changing the ice melt patterns in the Himalayan region, resulting in overdrawn of groundwater resources in the region and affecting the overall water security of the people of South Asia. South Asia is vulnerable to climate change and weather patterns, which increases the risk of vector-borne disease and transmission. Increased rainfall and flooding are precursors of waterborne disease such as cholera, typhoid, and other diseases in South Asia. South Asia is also facing the brunt of disaster due to climate change induced conditions, and disasters killed nearly 500,000 people in South Asia over the past 25 years alone. Like Bangladesh, human displacement will become another major cause of security in South Asia because many people will be rendered homeless due to sea level rise, due to temperature rise, and other climate induced conditions, making them or forcing them to migrate from their homes to other places within the region and perhaps and most surely out of the region. Because sea level rise will have profound impacts, coastal erosion, inundations of low-lying areas, salt intrusion, flooding due to storm surges and high tides, and habitat loss. These are the patterns of sea level rise impacts, not only in Bangladesh, but on the overall region of South Asia. So what should we do? There are many things to do, but I will just mention a few. We need an effective mitigation strategy, and that is a starting point. And I think we are falling short in this score in most places. In terms of South Asia, there will have to be securitization of the impacts of climate change in the region. particularly in Bangladesh, and therefore, in the response mechanism, like many other countries in the world, the military will have a definite role. And therefore, the role of military must be strategized now. They have to be trained, they have to be tooled, and they have to be prepared. That calls for a series of contingency planning at all levels, at the level of the community, at the level of the state, at the level of the region, and at the level of the international planning and contingency mechanisms. We need more knowledge, information, technology, and expertise sharing and exchanges, not only within the region, but internationally and globally. We all need to do a comprehensive adaptation strategy because some of the impacts, however we strategize to mitigate, are already here and they cannot be reversed. So, therefore, strategization will be the only answer to them. We have to have international and regional policy frameworks which are compatible and are not exclusive to one another to cope the challenges. Climate protection must be integrated as a cross-cutting theme into poverty reduction in all areas. Global information and early warning systems have to be expanded so that countries and regions are better prepared with early warning systems that calls also for public awareness. Overall, it will call for greater political will and cooperation at all levels, and certainly call for global consensus and global reaction to meet a challenge which is global, and it's a challenge of our civilization and a challenge of our humanity, and we have all got to act together. It is a climate emergency, and the time to act is now. I thank you all for your very patient hearing. It was a privilege for me to speak to you all today. Thank you to all our audience, and greetings to all of you from Bangladesh. Thank you.
Munir, thank you so much for an incredibly detailed presentation. And I take your point, which we'll explore a little later, about the need for global action. But if I can just ask you very specifically about Bangladesh, because you are a former military advisor to the president, you talked about how strategies have not translated to action. But I wonder if it's just about money. You talked about a lack of funds, but even with funds, how much capacity is there in Bangladesh to plan for a better future, given the struggles that are faced every day just living?
It is extremely difficult. Even with given the funds, Bangladesh will have to find it very difficult to implement the adaptation strategies because some of the impacts of climate change have now become irreversible. So the sea level rise will take away about 17 to 20%, 25% of Bangladeshi landmass, and that probably cannot be saved anymore. We have gone that past that point. So therefore, we've got to prepare for consequences. Bangladesh, as you know, is a country that is already struggling with many other challenges, challenges of poverty, challenges of overpopulation, challenges of hunger and feeding a large population. So climate change has all added on top of all that. So that makes the combination extremely lethal, which has impacts not only on the very basics of our needs for a living humanity, but it is now becoming an existential threat to the state.
Well, thank you, Munir. And as I said, we will continue that discussion, and particularly that point that the challenge that is facing Bangladesh is not just Bangladesh's problem. What faces Bangladesh faces also the rest of the world. Chris Barry joins us now, also via Zoom, but this time from Canberra. And just a reminder that Chris is also a member of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, everybody. Can I say what a great pleasure it is to be on this broadcast with General Munir Rizalman, who has been the chair of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change for quite a long time now. And I was utterly taken with his presentation in the sense that I cannot conceive that the challenges of dealing with the problem in Bangladesh can be solved in Bangladesh alone. And I guess that's just a shorthanded way of saying, you know what, global warming and climate change are going to affect us all. And all of us are going to experience the outcomes in different ways. But we're not going to be able to solve any of it by ourselves. And the truth is, unless we pull together, we're really not going to be able to deal effectively with all the future challenges we confront. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about a couple of perceptions that I've got before we lead into the more detailed look at Australia and solutions by former colleagues Cheryl and Michael. And I want to start by saying, firstly, that I've stopped talking about climate change as a standalone event. I now talk about global warming and climate change because actually the global warming component is essential to all the changes that we're dealing with, and it's not just about climate change. And I want to talk about the effects of global warming and climate change on Australia and the region. It's very timely, I think, right now to think about our world and how it has changed over the last 15 months or so. If anyone had said to us, there is an enormous summer of bushfires will hit the Australian mainland in a magnitude that we have never experienced before, we would have laughed at them. Now we know what it really feels like to be under attack by nature. And I know that many people in the Australian community have not forgotten what has happened to them a year or so ago. I've seen it in my not-for-profit dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. The rise in the number of members in the Australian community now affected by PTSD has risen quite significantly as a consequence of the bushfires. It wasn't because the fires occurred in themselves. It was the suddenness of the onset of a world turned right upside down and that challenged everything that you thought was safe and that you thought you'd made the proper preparations for, and to find that nature could overwhelm them in an instant. And I've heard the stories of people saying, when I saw that wall of fire advancing on my home and that eerie, loud noise that it created, I knew then that we were doomed. Now, those firestorms occurred all over the eastern coast of Australia and in some other places as well. And as we look back now, we can think about the health consequences, not just from heat, but particulate smoke as well. And of course, there are other now fallout consequences from the losses that have occurred and the destruction to the landforms. What's my learning from this? My learning from this is that we do need to be ready for reinvigorating our exploration of vulnerabilities and looking careful at all the comfortable assumptions that we've had to date about our future. Immediately after the bushfires drew down, we were beset by some floods in areas around Australia. And some of those floods occurred in areas that had been fire prone as well. So it wasn't just on one hand the fire, it was now the flooding. And then in March, to be exact about it, because I started collecting the figures, March 14, Australia experienced the onset of the pandemic. We're not out of the woods on the pandemic yet, and one of the reasons why this particular event has had to be basically online, concerns the uncertainties that lie ahead. But I think we have learned a great deal out of the bushfires and the pandemic about preparedness, or a lack of preparedness, or an up-to-date lack of preparedness. And I'm pretty sure that Michael Thomas will expand on that as we move ahead. It's also relevant when we think about the role of the military in trying to deal with all these things, that in the height of the bushfire season in New South Wales, 78,000 volunteer firefighters were fielded to try and deal with them. Well, that is quite a considerable number more that the Defence Force can put into the field, even on a good day. So a second frame of my learning is we need to look again at how prepared we are in terms of assets and response capabilities for dealing with these vulnerabilities. We also learned in the middle of the bushfires, and to a lesser extent now in the pandemic, about communication systems, data systems, control measures, and about leadership. Frankly, on leadership, I think our state governments can take great pride in their ability to deal with both situations despite the stresses of being not properly resourced and not getting adequate guidance from their federal counterparts. I think communities in Australia have also learned lessons about resilience, about the importance of community, and about rebuilding relationships at community level so people can help each other in the absence of more formal measures. It's interesting. Looking around our region and thinking about these issues, one thought that I've written down is that firstly, New Zealand seems to be doing better at relationships in parts of our region, and I'm thinking particularly of the Pacific Islands, than we do. Moreover, New Zealanders, because they live on the edge of the tectonic plate, seem to be much better and more aware of the possibility of disaster happening unexpectedly than we have been to date. And the other part of this equation is when I look to our north and a country like Indonesia, I wonder to what extent issues of global warming and climate change offer opportunities for Australia to build better bridges with that country for reasons that I will finish up with in this short presentation. To say nothing of the pandemic consequences being undergone there at the moment. Looking wider into our region, I take exactly all the points made by Muni in talking about Bangladesh and magnified in all the other countries of South Asia. I've had the privilege of being involved in workshops with professionals from that part of the world, looking at trying to solve their problems. But the truth is, the challenge of the problems is pretty much overwhelming in the absence of a collective planetary response. And finally, of course, we shouldn't forget to think about the countries of Southeast Asia and North Asia that don't look very often at our country, other than through the eyes of I think being rather jealous about the things we enjoy here in Australia. But all of us are going through the challenge of thinking about the new China. What does it really mean? What challenges does it present, even in the field of global warming and climate change? And what meaning is that going to have for the sorts of decisions we're going to need to make in the future? I want to finish up on a somber note. Anyway, I look at the magnitude of the problems we confront, whether it's in Australia, which is by many standards a very lucky country, especially compared to a country like Bangladesh. By 2050, the luxury of 25 million will have grown to about just over 40 million people, and we'll still have a population density of about 2 people per square kilometre. And if Mooney's 20 million people are looking for a new home, I can't help but think Australia is going to be mighty attractive. And secondly, we should never forget that there are many climate scientists who would argue that in terms of global warming consequences, Australia leads the pack. We've all seen it, the new colours for new temperature gradients at 50 degrees C plus, and the experience of an Australia where temperatures of over 40 degrees that were once on average about 5 times a summer are likely to head towards 30 or 40 times a summer by 2050. And finally, that our own management of the environment still leaves a lot to be desired. At the current rate of progress, it's my prediction that we are headed to somewhere between 3.5 and 4 degrees global warming by 2050, and that is a prospect that none of us can contemplate as we confront the challenges. And we must never forget that we're not fighting the events of the last war, but the war to come against global warming and climate change. Thanks very much.
Chris, thank you. Just a quick question before we move on. You started and you talked a lot about the learnings, and I just wonder, when you look back a year ago to those horrific bushfires, if there was any silver lining, it was that it drew enormous attention to the issue of climate change. Do you think that 12 months down the track, we've lost that momentum?
I think it's a risk, and I think it's an unpalatable risk even now. I would say there's a 40% chance that's going to happen, Ali. And I also think my learning is the state premiers did a lot better than the federal government. I think state premiers have written a new mantra, which is that people are more important than an economy. You can't have an economy without people, and you can always rebuild an economy. But you know what? We can't get back 909 people who died in Australia from the pandemic. And moreover, when we take out from our pandemic deaths, the deaths in aged care homes in Victoria, which is fundamentally a federal government responsibility, our performance was a lot better than it looks on the start record of the figures.
Well, let's hope that that 40% chance turns to something much lower by conversations like this one, which hopefully will spark the sort of action that we need. Chris, thank you. Cheryl Durant joins us next. She is with us in the Capitol Theatre here in Melbourne, and Cheryl recently retired after 30 years with the ADF. Over to you, Cheryl.
I'd just like to take 2 key points from both of our first 2 speakers. I think that's really important for setting the context of the question of, are we prepared for this and what do we need to do? So the first of that one is, it's global. Climate change is not a necessary national security problem, it's a global security problem or a planetary security problem. We've heard quite convincingly that this is more than just a military conflict issue. It's about food security, water security, agriculture, pretty much everything is bundled up in this climate change problem, so it's global. It's also an emergency. Get absolutely clear, this is now a climate emergency. I think that's come across very clearly from the first two speakers. Unfortunately, if we'd had our sort of hindsight and perfect forecast vision, we would have been acting on climate change 30 years ago. Or perhaps if we delayed a bit, 10 years ago. We missed those opportunities, so we now can't have a slow transition to dealing with climate change. We need to have a climate emergency mobilisation. We need to recognise, and it's the first sort of key principle of preparedness, is look honestly at the world as it is, not as you want it to be. I think a lot of us would like to go back to the world as it was, certainly in Australia, before COVID or before the bushfires. It's quite a comforting feeling, or quite a comforting thought. We can go back to how we were. But in reality, that's passing now. We've heard from Bangladesh, the crisis is impacting them now. It has been for decades. We've heard from Chris about those communities who were hit by the bushfires in Australia at the start of last year. Climate change is very real for them. It's not something happening in the future. So the real first thing in preparedness is take a good, honest look at what the risks and vulnerabilities are. And I think at the moment, that's where Australia is lacking. We haven't had a national security risk assessment or a climate risk security risk assessment. It's just not there. Other countries have done this, and more broadly than just looking at the military, across the whole of society risks. And that certainly is the thing that needs to happen now. We can't just rely on a technology roadmap, because that technology roadmap's not informed by a real deep understanding of our risks and vulnerabilities. Now, some good work has been done. The Department of Home Affairs produced an excellent study of Australia's vulnerabilities, the Australian vulnerability profile. But it focused on a narrow set of disaster risks, and climate change is more pervasive than that. It actually impacts on some of those geostrategic issues that COVID has surfaced, like the ability for us to get medical supplies through a global supply chain if we don't manufacture them here. It's also highlighted quite recently our reliance on fossil fuels, another part of our supply chain, which we're reliant on the globe providing us. So as a country, we're in many ways very vulnerable to disruptions on a global scale. I'd like to just talk a little bit more about energy there, because if climate change is the problem, then energy change is the solution. And certainly Australia, this is where the opportunity is for Australia, and it's an amazing opportunity. If you look at the energy supply chain of fossil fuels, as we heard today, we don't have it. So even from a pragmatic security perspective, we're not prepared for major disruptions to international supply chains. And if you then think about our major defence equipment, it's all fossil fuel related. So if it's interrupted, we've now got a legacy defence force that can't really operate effectively in a world where fossil fuel is interrupted, or a world where fossil fuel is so on the nose with all the other countries that Australia's not invited to play. And yet there's opportunity here, because Australia sits on amazing renewable energy resources, not just in terms of wind and sun and wave, of which we've got plenty, but also in terms of the critical minerals of the renewable energy supply chain. Now, I was really quite encouraged I'm very rarely encouraged by government speeches, but I was encouraged to see in Scott Morrison's speech at the Press Club last week a mention that we needed to look down and understand the security supply chain and the critical supply chain for the minerals of renewable energy. So perhaps there's a little chink, there's a little wedge going there to take that opportunity. And also Australia has many businesses. I was speaking to a small energy company earlier this week that has actually got amazing technology that it's developed in support of mining, because our Northwestern and Northern Territory mines are often off-grid. So amazing energy systems, smart, renewable, ready to there. And think about how we address some of those problems in Bangladesh or in Indonesia, which Chris and Mooney have posed. What would a security benefit of an Australian company heading out overseas and being able to supply resilient renewable energy to that country do? It's a win-win-win. It's a win for our business. It's a win for our international standing, and it's a win for reducing carbon emissions, which needs to happen to stay under that emergency footing. And from a defence perspective too, as we've been going through an energy transition, we're also going through a transition in the capabilities that defence needs to win wars, should the worst come to the worst, which hopefully won't. So we've seen a transition from World War I, a war of coal, World War II, a war of fossil fuels. As we look out into the future, there are several new domains emerging which are absolutely critical from a security perspective. One is space, because pretty much all of our communication systems rely in some way, shape or form on space. And space is not necessarily something that needs refined fuel products. Space is an area where solar power, hydrogen fuel cells can have a big role to play. So again, in the new security world, we're no longer necessarily concerned with the importance of oil refineries in Romania, but we also need to understand how space will impact upon security and cyberspace. Information centres, again, they don't run on diesel fuel, they run on power. So again, I think there's a whole lack of realisation in our security thinking, both domestically and globally, about the role of a world which has access to renewables and ensuring that in sort of responding to the climate crisis, we don't get sucked into the same geopolitics we see now, where countries with the fossil fuels have a certain amount of clout globally. So we have a chance to reshape the world in a way we might like to reshape the world. And for those of you who are grey-haired, perhaps like many of us, I can remember a time where Australia was a leader internationally. It was a leader in some of the early UN initiatives. It's been a leader before internationally. And yet I see when I look around now on climate change, Australia's not a leader. It's largely viewed as a blocker. There's no reason why it can't be a leader. Our businesses are leaders. We see initiatives in both Western Australia and in the Northern Territory of exporting renewable powers into the region that we're worried about the stability for. So I think I'm just going to conclude there, because there's a lot more I could go into. But in terms of preparedness, it's really about understanding the world, not as we want it to be, but as it is, acting with urgency and addressing the energy problem.
If I can ask you a quick question, because you made some really interesting links there, and I wonder, do you think that part of the big problem is that we don't actually make those links? So at the moment, there's a story around the closure of the Altona refinery in Victoria, which is being very much played as a, gosh, we won't be able to get petrol in our cars, not a sort of discussion about broader energy security, the thought that, yes, we can't then fund our defence forces, which then means they can't help. Like, we don't go from A to B to C to D and follow the logical progression.
I think that's an excellent point, Ali. In fact, I was almost saying, instead of sort of having a title, Expect the Unexpected, we need a slogan, sort of Connect the Unconnected. And really, we tend in Australia, we're great at response. We're really great at putting band-aids on problems when they arise. And we address a problem in a silo over here, health, or a silo over there, fuel. Modern global society is inherently very interconnected, and we need systems approaches. And the Home Affairs work on vulnerability did take a systems approach. So we're starting to do this work. And we also have very powerful big data and artificial intelligence that can start to unpack the complexity of the modern world, because certainly it's too difficult for individual human minds sometimes to get around how complex global supply chains are and what a policy decision about a fossil fuel refinery is going to do on Australia's standing internationally or on agricultural minerals. And one of the points that I recall is Queensland, when they had closed the refinery some years ago now, suddenly found that they didn't have the bituminous products they need to resurface roads. So if we are going to move off fossil fuel, what are we going to be resurfacing our roads with? So there's all these complex questions to answer.
Yep, Cheryl, thank you. The knee bone is connected to the thigh bone, and so it goes on. And of course, Cheryl will join us as we continue our conversation. Our last speaker this evening, before we do open it up to questions, and just a reminder that you can put your questions through by logging on to slido.com. Our last formal presentation is Dr. Michael Thomas. And as we said earlier, Michael is a senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Centre for Climate and Security. Michael, all yours.
Thank you, Ali. When Australians think about who provides national security, many people instinctively think that it's the military that does this job. And while they might, we spend $43 billion every year on the ADF alone. And it's a fun fact that, in a global context, there are more than 100 countries that actually don't have a GDP that matches the ADF's annual budget. When capability acquisitions are factored in, taxpayers will fund the military to more than $1.5 trillion out to the next decade, to 2030. So that's $575 billion. So each of us has skin in the game to ask, how does climate change impact the ADF? Does it have the right resourcing to meet the challenges of climate change? Does it have the right equipment? How does it impact its training, its infrastructure, the vast defence estate, its personnel, soldiers, sailors and airmen? And what about social licence aspects in relation to its own fossil fuel use, which is not inconsiderable? And what's its strategy? And I guess optimistically, can defence industry actually be part of the solution to develop clean energy fuels for not just our military, but also for commercial spin-off? Scratch the surface and more fundamental questions emerge also. 2020 provides a stark example, as we've been hearing. $40 billion couldn't prevent a pandemic, nor could it prevent the bushfires. So ironically, while we have never spent more on our security, we have never felt more insecure. And so all this begs the question, is the government responsibly investing for the security consequences of the Anthropocene, of which climate change is a major part? For the purpose of this short presentation, I submit that climate change is having two main impacts on the Australian Defence Force and the military. And I'm really going to, I guess, downscale and narrow the conversation to defence in particular. The first is the international geostrategic dimensions, and this has already been touched on. The basic equation is this, though. If you add more greenhouse gases, then you end up with a less secure, more hostile world. It's imperative that to prevent this from happening, that we decarbonise the global economy, and it needs to start now. In the lingua franca of security studies, climate change is a threat multiplier, and this has been touched on. And this is to say that climate change may not directly cause war or conflict, but that it can exacerbate existing tensions and pressures such that they become worse and spill over into violence. And sadly, Syria in 2011 is demonstrably a sad case study of what can happen in that situation. Arguably, climate change is increasing the likelihood also that the future will become more violent. More violence between farmers, tribes, communities, groups and states as regional climate changes drive increasing competition over scarce resources, and food and water are central to this. And as has been touched on, poor nations unable to adapt will suffer disproportionately. More apparent, however, of course, is the impacts of extreme weather. And we live in what has been termed disaster alley, more cyclones, floods, droughts, wildfires. And when our Pacific Island friends look at Australia, climate change is central to their very survival. It is their #1 security concern. So climate change is influencing the international security dynamics of nations and people, and this in turn influences how the ADF is structured and how it prepares and delivers on its international responsibilities. The second impact, of course, that climate change is having is on the home front. Unlike earlier eras where the enemy was over there and we built and structured our military around a particular adversary just a little bit better, not too much, but just a little bit better so we could succeed. Well, climate change is a threat that undermines the military before it's even left the front gate. Here are some examples. The ADF is the single largest landholder in Australia. It has dozens of bases at sea level. Naval ports, airstrips, army bases, you name it, 3.5 million hectares, 30,000 buildings, 72 major bases, training areas and research facilities. Many of these ranges are, ironically, ecologically in pretty good shape because they've prevented development from occurring where they've been located. $68 billion in value. It's truly a national asset. Climate change undermines the capability of the defence estate. Sea level rise, inundation from storm surge and extreme weather all present increasing risk to the defence estate. As shareholders in the ADF, have we been adequately informed of these risks, and are the bases resilient to climate risks, and what is the ADF doing about it? Casting forward, the ADF will need to be much smarter how it integrates with local and state planning authorities on climate adaptation. I've seen some examples where local climate adaptation planning literally stops at the defence base because of the administrative and cultural gulf between local government planning authorities, state government planning authorities, and federal agencies. ADF bases tend to think and act with a federal mindset and often lack strong participation and engagement at the local level. So this needs to change. Defence bases are not islands unto themselves, and physics simply does not work like that. Related to the defence estate is forced mobilisation, getting the ADF out the door. These bases rely on the support of critical civilian infrastructure, power, water and sewerage services, transport links, supply lines and so on. Climate change presents risks to these key enablers. So thinking through the interdependencies and climate resilience of those critical enablers is crucial. Many bases, Army ones in particular, are also in fire-prone areas. I think of Puckapunyal, High Range in Townsville, Canungra, Shoalwater Bay in Queensland. Longer fire seasons are impacting Army's training cycles. We've seen how this can go dramatically wrong. The State Mine Fire in 2013 burnt more than 100,000 hectares. It cost 2 lives and destroyed 500 buildings. That was caused by a defence live fire training exercise just out of Sydney. In 2019, a fire that ripped through the World Heritage Rainforest near Canungra was suspected from the nearby Kokoda Barracks. And then, of course, in January last year, a defence helicopter, the landing gear of that defence helicopter, ignited a fire in the Namadgi State Park and burnt out 80% of that national park. So these are real issues having real consequences for both the ADF, but also for the adjacent communities. And it will begin to prompt a rethink on the suitability of training grounds in near peri-urban areas, local communities, and also national parks. Military training in hotter climates also becomes more difficult. The impacts of heat stress on soldiers, sailors, airmen is a real one that requires adjustments to when, where, and how soldiers train. So, these are going to be basic things like low carriage, rest rates, and so on. Military is trained for tough situations, but heat stress is an issue that even affects top athletes. I've just finished reading Paddy Manning's book, Body Count, and I think this gives a good idea on the wider impacts of climate change in terms of air quality and other health-related consequences that will be experienced by not just ADF members, but also their families. It's difficult to stay focused when you're on deployment, but to have your family impacted as well is doubly difficult. Of course, Black Summer showed that climate change is also altering the frequency, scale, and intensity and duration of homeland defence operations. Mallacoota, Kangaroo Island, Batemans Bay, Cobargo, Australia is now the front line. Operation Bushfire Assist saw some 9,000 members deployed across 4 states of Australia for 6 months. 500 foreign military personnel also flew in to help out. It was the largest peacetime deployment that our nation has seen. And I think it changed how people view the ADF. The ADF were out there as vets, they were out there as engineers, they were providing clean water, sanitation, and succour to the local communities. So I think this is starting to change really how we view the ADF. And I think Peter Jennings' comments, who heads up ASPI, had a good point here in the aftermath of the bushfires on the idea of re-rolling and changing and perhaps strengthening the role of reservists to play that more local connection with communities in times of disaster relief. In a very different context is emerging in the use of the ADF. There is a shift in community expectations that the ADF will be there and that this is part of core business. In one sense, climate change affords an opportunity to rethink how the ADF should be structured, how it engages, trains and plans with state and local authorities, and also where the weight of effort should lie in terms of its capability balance. It also leads to discussions on how defence industry and research efforts can lead on the development of new fuels. That coincidentally could have the dual benefit of making our military fleet cut the tether from oil and also have commercial spin-offs. While there are important lessons from all of this, I think, to be frank, we shouldn't be talking about how our military should be restructured or how we can better use it. We should really be talking about how we can decarbonise the economy and make it a much more safe operating environment for everyone. So this should be a wake-up call. To avoid Black Summer becoming the Black Decade, we need to immediately decarbonise our economy and focus on recovering from the damage that's been done.
Given that it's not, as you say, it's not about defence, and defence is certainly not there to provide the solution, but given that they have been so much at the front line, and as we see all over the world, they see the risks. They are the first ones called to the cyclone in Fiji or the bushfires in Australia. Why is defence relatively silent from a public point of view? And please feel free to take issue with me, but I rarely see an ADF person out there beating a drum.
It's a really good question. I think the ADF has been challenged. It's a highly politicised issue in Australia, first and foremost. And the ADF being an apolitical institution really finds it very difficult to navigate around those sensitive political issues. So I think that's one of the, to the nation's detriment, that it has become highly politicised, has been one of the reasons why the ADF has almost been unable to be out there discussing it in the public, communicating what it's doing about climate change, because it is doing things about climate change. But yeah, from a public point of view, very difficult to convey that while it's highly politicised.
And we'll pursue the issue of the ADF a little bit later. Thank you for your presentation. Just a reminder, if you hop onto slido.com and then if you log into RESET.21, if you'd like to ask a question. And in fact, one of the questions that's come through is indeed the question that I have, and I'd like to start by posing to Munir, just to try and narrow this down without being a warmonger as such. But the question says, through which pathways do you think climate issues may lead to international or military conflict? And just to add to that, my question was around where you see the biggest security threat in the region. Is it water? Is it, the impact of that leading to mass mobilization of people? Is it regional conflict? What is it, do you think, that's likely to be the greatest source of a threat to global security? Munir, can I ask you?
Yeah, thank you, Ali. I think the 3 points that have been touched are the key sources of insecurity. The main source of insecurity, as I can see, is human displacement. Well, the reason that I said this because we've seen that a few thousand conflict-ridden refugees in Europe almost destabilize the political systems in the continent. These are the refugees that came out of the Syrian civil war. But here, we are not talking about thousands. We are not even talking about hundreds of thousands. We're talking about millions of people on the move. And when millions of people are on the move and trying to find out a safe and a dry place for themselves to live, they'll go anywhere. They'll go to any country, any continent. So that is going to be very destabilizing unless we are prepared for that and we have international frameworks and response mechanisms to cope with that. The second issue of insecurity is going to come from a constellation of food, water, and energy security. And in that, food and water are going to be in the forefront. In the context of South Asia, I would say that if there is ever a conflict in South Asia, it's going to be triggered by water insecurity, because now we have grave water security issues between China and India over the Brahmaputra water. We have grave security challenges of water sharing between India and Pakistan over the Indus Water Treaty. And imagine, these are all countries that have had a history of conflict. These are all countries that have the largest conventional militaries and also have nuclear capabilities. So we are really sitting on the top of a volcano in case if there is any conflict that is triggered by water conflict or hydro conflict issues. And the third one might come out of resource sharing and resource conflict, but that I would put that at the bottom of the 3 in that queue. Thank you.
Thank you, Munir. Chris Barry, if I can ask you the same question, where you see, I suppose, the greatest source of instability, and you actually finished your formal presentation by a reference to Australia being a very attractive place. Is that where you see that the greatest source of potential instability, mass movement of people, and many perhaps heading south?
Look, I think it's pretty hard to predict precisely how instability will unfold in this nature. Years ago, I gave a presentation which began with the idea that it was starvation of the soldiers that led to the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the Soviet state. And Mooney has already put his finger on the problem of South Asia. The lack of fresh water to those countries is going to affect food supply, and that is going to affect how people look at each other and treat each other. And under the pressures of starvation and dehydration and health issues, the civil societies will collapse very quickly. So I've been in the Parliament House. I've predicted the flight of Bangladesh people to Australia. And I was asked by a particular minister that I won't name how many. I said, well, let's just say 10 million for a start. They won't all come at once. They'll come in dribs and drabs. But imagine our 46 million sitting here, fat, dumb and happy and reasonably comfortable, looking at this sudden change. And frankly, I don't think that's a future that I like the look of, because it's going to make it ugly in almost every way you can think as we struggle to survive on the planet.
It's the whole discussion that we're having, where we have a focus on climate change as a security issue. This leads to the next question, which actually I'm going to put to you, Cheryl, but it is a very interesting one. It comes from our audience. Do you have concerns that militarization and securitization of this issue will lead to nationalism and prevent refugee flows into neighbouring countries? I think it's a great question, because we don't often, this security focus is one that is not necessarily new, but it takes a slightly different tack and certainly broadens the argument, and is one that helps to create more pressure for change. But there's a flip side, isn't there?
There is, and having worked in the national security world for 30 years, I think one of the dangers is to think in that way about climate change as a problem. Because climate change doesn't have an enemy. Who's the enemy in climate change? Is it America? Because they've got historically the largest emissions. Is it Australia? Because we've got the biggest emissions for GDP. Perhaps we should go for war on ourselves. Or is it China, because they have the still growing emissions and now the largest emissions? So there's no clear enemy. And national security really works in a world where there's limited resources or attractive resources, one group, another group, and they compete over those resources, and one wins or loses. And that approach is not going to solve a global problem. So I actually agree with the premise of the question. I think there is a lot of danger about national security, and it's certainly, I've been discouraged in the post-COVID world by seeing increasing nationalism. And there's some hope coming out of America, and there's still hope coming out of Europe, but it also needs those, Chris described us as fat, dumb and happy. I'd probably qualify for one of those. But also needs an acceptance that some of us have to relinquish what we've had. We can't actually all have necessarily everything we've had before. And that's just too at the moment, it's too high a carbon budget. So there needs to be an acceptance that in order for the best chance for the planet, some countries with substantial capabilities may just have to give up a little bit more in order that other countries can have that transition. Otherwise, those 2 million people are coming for us, or those 10 million people are coming for us.
So, Michael, I wonder whether you agree with Cheryl, but also how do we walk that line then between, on the one hand, pointing out that it is an existential security risk, and we have to understand that that helps to drive decision making, but on the other hand, please don't shut your borders and please don't act in, as a nationalist government as opposed to a global government? That's a really great question, a real challenge. There are pros and cons. On the positive side, on the one hand, it's the engagement of the military in the national conversation is an opportunity to reach into new audiences that otherwise, do not listen to or have not listened to what some of the core issues are in relation to climate change. So there is that opportunity for change, as you say, to generate change and to mobilise public opinion around the need to do it. And that's what I mentioned in my brief presentation there. We don't want to be having this conversation. In fact, it would be great if we weren't actually sitting here having this conversation. And it should be a wake-up call to head down. And I think the question is really pertinent, because that's the risk. This is a risk that if we go down this path, it creates these dystopian worlds that we just don't want to end up in. And so I suppose raising the conversation around the security issues of climate change, which, as you pointed out earlier, hasn't been a part of the national discussion really until we see it, until we feel it, until we live it. We are now the front line. And so this should be a wake-up call for everyone, particularly governments, to start taking action on it.
I think that's a good point, Michael. Imagine what the questions ought to be going forward to the next conference of the parties in Glasgow as we confront the next federal election sometime in the next 9 months to a year. I mean, what would we expect our government to go to Glasgow with to satisfy a return to some sort of Australian leadership in the field?
And Chris, you talked about Australian leadership, but Munir, if I can ask you about regional leadership and this question of on the one hand, recognising climate change as a security risk, and on the other hand, not wanting to turn governments to become too nationalistic. If you look at the region, I mean, look at what's happening in Myanmar at the moment. Look what's happened in other countries. Where do you see that line between recognising the risk but not trying to get borders shut?
Only we are all in a state of denial. We know the problem is there, we know the problem is coming, but yet we are putting our heads in the sand. All our countries are becoming super nationalists. And the COVID has also shown us that we are even prepared to play nationalism with our lives and with our vaccines. Just imagine that there is recognition of all categories of refugees in the world, but there is no category of environmental refugee or a climate refugee. So we don't even recognize the problem in legal terms. So therefore, we have not addressed the issue at all. All I'm trying to say is that this is a wave and a tsunami that is coming. It is always better to be prepared for it so that we have some semblance of international governance structures in place so that we can regulate the tsunami or regulate the waves that are coming. But at the very moment, we are all in a state of denial. At the regional level, you can even imagine that the border between Bangladesh and India has been unilaterally fenced by India. Perhaps with the hope that someday this will prevent movement of climate refugees or people moving out of Bangladesh. But I can assure you that when people want to find a safer ground to survive, they'll go anywhere, not only within the region, but anywhere else in the world. Therefore, it is best to cope the problem as an international community, not narrowly thinking about the small area, because climate change does not recognize international borders, unfortunately. We have boxed ourselves in the Westphalian system so rigidly that it is not compatible with the challenges of climate change. We've got to rethink, we've got to think out of the box to find a solution to this.
And do you think, Munir, that if you look at the experiences of the COVID crisis, of the pandemic in the region, how do you think that informs the geopolitical changes that might happen? And I know Michael was making the point earlier about some of the changes. I mean, it did seem at the outset of the pandemic that we were seeing a huge withdrawal to nationalism, people protecting their personal protective equipment, people not wanting to share. But that seems to have improved as resources have improved. How do you think that the experience of the pandemic will inform the geopolitics of climate change?
I don't think we see any positive outcome out of the pandemic behavior or the post-pandemic behavior. Because if you look at the way the nations are behaving in hoarding, in finding narrow ways of only looking after themselves with vaccines, in no way says that we have found that this is a global problem. Like the pandemic is a global problem and we're addressing exactly the wrong way. Exactly the same way that we are trying to address the impacts of climate change. Let me briefly share with you an experience of a war game that was hosted by the British government, played out in different capitals, of which I was a part. In that, the mass movement of people, the reaction from the players in the war game who were playing different nations was that there were even people to carry out what they said controlled genocide to stop movement of people. But that is the wrong way of approaching a global problem. Our speakers today very rightly said that this is a global problem, has to be solved globally. No single country or no single region can alone solve the problem unless we have done some together, because the nature of the problem is not country specific, not even a region specific problem. I've been in conferences with some historians before who were very clear to point out that the large-scale climate changes have taken place historically in the universe, but we never faced a problem at that time because then people and resources could move freely amongst the countries and the borders. The problem is more acute now because we are very, very rigid on our Westphalian border and the state system. And that is in conflict with the nature of the crisis.
Chris, Barry, do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think it's fascinating to hear. I agree with a lot of that content. I mean, you know, we've seen it here with state versus state, that sense of our state's somehow different to your state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said in mine, I mean, some of the challenges we're trying to deal with are truly planetary, and you just can't deal with it in one place at a time. And so we need the collective effort. Put in another way, you know, we're going to grow the world populations estimated by 25% between now and 2050. And every one of those new human beings is going to be a food eater, water user, an energy consumer. You know, they're all going to contribute to the problem. And the way, what worries me about that is, wow, if we can't solve this problem now with 7.5 billion people, how are we going to do this with 9+? It's harder. But I don't want it to all be black. I do think that some of the experience I've had working with the younger generations who, in my words, better educated to these problems than my generation, I think they're much more open to the kinds of solutions that Mooney's talking about. And I'd like to see a greater sense of global citizenship and not national citizenship. You know, that's potentially where we need to go, to take the old leaders out of the way and let some of these young people have a go.
I was going to say, Chris, I like to finish on a note of optimism, but I'm not sure that was entirely optimistic, because a lot of us will just be sort of cut off if that's the case. But I take your point there about a new generation coming through, and the idea of being a global citizen as opposed to a national citizen. And for fear of maybe not being so optimistic, but Michael, I just wanted to know, is there a point at which, when we look at particularly looking at it from the perspective of Bangladesh at the moment, we look at the security risks posed by climate change, is there a point at which we just run out of time?
Gee, I'd like to think that, no, I'd like to think that these are solvable challenges. And we've been talking about the impact of COVID, and, you know, that there's a lot of bad news out there. Well, actually, COVID has actually, you know, been a silver lining in terms of a reduction in global emissions, up to almost a 7% drop in 2020 emissions globally.
Hell of a way to get
so
there.
That's a great kickstart on the way to decarbonising the economy, almost a free kick in many respects. So if we can keep on that trajectory, then some of the things that Munir was talking about, you know, they'll be averted if we can do that. So I've come to realise myself that you've got to maintain hope in this, and you know, grab those that present that hope. So yeah.
And indeed, Cheryl, you talked about opportunity.
Yes, so I think we also have to remember that we don't know when or where the sort of some of those black forecasts may occur. And so we need to look at it like every fraction of a degree matters. So we might have missed 1.2, or we're at that now. We might not get 1.5, but we're not really sure where those catastrophic impacts will hit in. So it's not time to throw up our hands and say it's all too difficult. It's time now to say, well, we've got to work hard for every fraction of a degree. And Chris mentioned the optimism in youth, but I'm also optimistic with some amazing combinations of organisations around the planet, including the City of Melbourne's Regen initiative that's happening now. There's great citizens groups forming. There's multinational groups like the C40 Cities group, the Rockefeller Resilient Cities. So where nation states, that system may be failing, new cross-nation, cross-people, cross-community, cross-generations and gender organisations are moving to fill the gap, and we've just got to help them move faster and fast enough.
And we mustn't use the need to be a global citizen as an excuse to kick the can down the road, because yes, no one can do it alone, but it takes everyone to do it together.
Yep, exactly.
Look, an enormous thank you to all our speakers this evening and to you for chiming in with your questions as well. If I can thank Major General Munir Uzaman, Chris Barry, Cheryl Durant and Dr. Michael Thomas. I'd like to say, well, that's my clap, one hand clapping there, but you can imagine that there are claps all around from those who have been listening to what has been an absolutely fascinating conversation and certainly a lot of detail that we've learned about the situation facing so many in the world. The next RESET.21 forum is on Saturday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You'll be pleased that after tonight's hot, wet and violent theme, the title for Saturday's discussion is The Cooling Conundrum. And on that note, I'll thank you very much for joining us. Thank our speakers. Stay well and stay safe.